What's up, everybody? 大家好. Minasan, konnichiwa. This is Ben Parker back with another Chinese-Japanese tip video. And today's topic is specifically on Chinese versus Japanese and which one's harder and just what are the kind of, I don't want to say pros and cons of the two because I like studying both. They're both a lot of fun, but just, what's easier about one or the other and what makes one harder than the other. So that is the topic of today's video. And so I'm just going to dive straight into this. For those that, have seen some of my Chinese Japanese tip videos in the past, you guys already should know a little bit about my journey. I've been doing a lot of most of my studying of Chinese and Japanese has been on YouTube specifically. And, I do have some good grammar books as well. But I've been mostly studying on YouTube, and YouTube has tons of great resources. And so in an earlier YouTube video, I share some of my favorite resources, so feel free to check those out. And I also will be doing an updated version of that soon as well for both Chinese and Japanese, as well as Cantonese, because I've started to do a little Cantonese as well. No gongsi xiao xiao gong hua. Hope I said that right. I know how to say a little in Cantonese. But the purpose of this video is specifically Chinese versus Japanese. And just what's easier about one or the other, what makes it harder. And by Chinese, I'm going to include both Mandarin and Cantonese in this, just because I think the ways in which Mandarin is harder than Japanese is the same with Canto, and then the way in which Japanese is easier, it applies, so, I mean, while Mandarin and Cantonese are different, I think when comparing them to Japanese, I think it's, doesn't really matter. So we can just say Chinese, and I'm talking about, you can think Mandarin, Cantonese, both in the same thing. In that sense, in terms of comparing them. So let's get into this. So starting with Chinese, how is Chinese easier than Japanese? The first thing I have listed down is that Chinese has simpler grammar. Okay, so Chinese grammar is much simpler than Japanese grammar. So what makes it simpler? Well, for one thing, Chinese right off the bat, simple sentences in Chinese are SVO, subject, verb, object. So for example, 我吃饭 means I eat food, right? So 我 is I, 吃 means to eat, 饭 is food in Chinese, and specifically that's Mandarin I'm speaking. So all my Chinese examples will be Mandarin for this video, but going forward. But so 我吃饭 is Mandarin for I eat food. And I mean, SVO, simple sentences. So if you're an English speaker, we're used to the same thing. I eat food, 我吃饭, same thing. And then Chinese doesn't have verb conjugations, right? Mandarin doesn't have verb conjugations. Cantonese doesn't have verb conjugations. Chinese as a whole does not have verb conjugations, which is nice, very nice. So, for example, if you want to say I go in Chinese, you would just say 我去. And then if you just want to say like I went, you would say 我去了. Add a la at the end of it means I went, right? Or I ate. I eat is 我吃饭, right? 我吃饭. I eat food. And if you just say I ate, you would say 我吃了, right? So just add a la. So it's very simple. Like Chinese is very, very simple grammatically. Oh, also too, I'm not going to be including Chinese subtitles or Japanese subtitles in this video, just because the examples are kind of more secondary. But if anybody like really wants me to add subtitles, I'm more than happy to add them later. So my previous video I did do subtitles, but this one I'm just not going to do them unless people really want them, then I'm happy to do it. So just FYI on that. Chinese grammar is really simple. It's much simpler. No verb conjugations. I mean that's super nice. You learn a verb, you learn churs to eat. That's it. Not have to worry about it going forward. You learn that he means to drink. That's it, right? Yeah. So in Mandarin, it's he means to drink in Mandarin. So yeah, I mean, you learn a verb in Chinese, you're good. You got it. You have to conjugate it. You have to conjugate it. You just add a la to make a past tense. You're good to go. I mean, it's that simple. So Chinese grammar is really, really simple, and that's a plus that is in the Chinese category. That is in the column for Chinese. And then also the third thing I had written down for what makes Chinese easier or positive, like makes Chinese an easy component of Chinese, is that it has one writing system. It's got Hanzi, the Chinese characters. This is also what makes it harder too, which I'll get into in a second, but it is nice in Chinese that there's just one writing system. It's just characters. There's no alphabet, no multiple script. It's one script, and you just learn the characters, and that's it. Very straightforward. So that's nice. So yeah, so to recap with Chinese, what makes Chinese easier than Japanese, in my view, is the simpler grammar, the fact and the one writing system. Oh, and then also the third thing I was going to mention too is that there's more people to practice with. So that's a nice bonus with Chinese. A lot more Chinese people walking around the United States than Japanese people to practice with. So you might have an easier time finding people to practice with the Chinese and Japanese. That's kind of a third thing. But in terms of the language itself, it's the simpler grammar, the one writing system, just the characters. That's it, which is kind of nice in a way. Okay. And then as far as what makes Chinese harder than Japanese, the first thing that just jumps right out is the tones, right? So in Chinese, tones affect the meaning of each word, right? So in Mandarin, for example, the word ma, all mean different things, right? So ma means mother, ma means numb, ma means horse, and ma means to scold or to chastise. So, I mean, they all have different meanings depending on the tone that's used. And then in Cantonese, just really quickly, they have 6 tones. So it goes C, 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 C. Okay. And so, yeah, so Cantonese has got 6 tones, got more tones than Mandarin does. Although this part isn't as scary about Cantonese as people make it out to be, because you can get 2 and 5, you can flip 2 and 5, 3 and 6. People understand you. So it's not as scary as people make it out to be. But yeah, there's tones, right? And each word, depending on how you say the tone, has a completely different meaning, right? And then also too, Chinese has a lot of homophones as well. And so the word shi means lion. It also means wet. Other things too, right? So I mean, which is what makes Chinese tongue twisters a lot of fun, and a lot of kind of similar kind of sounds too. Yeah, so like si shi si, shi shi shi, like 4 is 4, 10 is 10, that kind of thing, like that tongue twister. Like, I mean, yeah, the tones are fun, but they also make it harder. And then it makes it hard for pronunciation, and it also makes it harder to listen and understand people too, because you got to make sure you're hearing the right tone and you're speaking the right tone. So yeah, so tones definitely make Chinese harder. That is definitely like atop the list of, like, from a speaking perspective and listening perspective, of why Chinese is harder than Japanese. So tones. All right, y'all. And then the second point I got for Chinese is something that I also said was easier. So look, I said that having one writing system makes Chinese easier than Japanese. This is true. Japanese has 3. I'll get to that in a second: hiragana, katakana, and kanji. But on the flip side, everybody, 大家, everyone, Chinese characters are tough. Like, 非常难学, really hard, really hard. It's hard to read. It's tough. Chinese characters are tough. You got, like, there's 80,000 characters in total. Now, if you can get, there's like 1,500 kind of core ones that are the most frequent. And if you get up to like 10,000, 10,000, that's about as much as most people know, even the highest levels. But yeah, I mean, the characters are tough, and and you got to memorize them. And there's like tips and tricks and ways to do it. It's not super scary. I think I did a video about this earlier. It's not something to freak out about, but like um, just having characters and characters only. While yes, it's nice, it's just one writing system. The one writing system that Chinese has is the hardest of the three writing systems in Japanese. So that I hope that kind of makes sense. So just having characters and no alphabet makes Chinese a lot tougher than Japanese. Makes Chinese tougher than Japanese. Chinese does have a thing called Juyin. It's in Taiwan. It's like an alphabet. You can just look it up. Look up Juyin Bopo Mopo. It's like Taiwan's version of an alphabet, but they don't actually use it in their like writing documents and stuff. It's just used as a tool to help kids learn characters. And one other thing on characters too is if you're learning Chinese, you go learn both simplified and traditional characters. So mainland China uses simplified characters, Taiwan uses traditional characters, and 80% of the characters are the same. There's a 20% difference, and a lot of those are characters that are used rather frequently. So that's another challenge too. You got to learn the simplified from mainland China, and if you want to if you want to go live in Taiwan and you're Mandarin there, you got to learn traditional characters. And then also too, if you want to learn like Cantonese, like I'm just starting to do, you have to learn traditional characters as well. Yeah, and as well as a lot of other dialects. If you learn Shanghainese, you got to learn traditional characters. So yeah, I mean that makes Chinese tougher. So we got tones, which is both harder for listening and pronunciation. We have only the characters. That's tough. And then the third thing is, I haven't talked about this yet, but I will just now, is regional influence, regional dialects. Now, what does this mean? So look, everyone in mainland China and Taiwan speaks Mandarin. That's why they call it Guoyu, means national language. Guo means country, Yu means language. That's why one way to call Mandarin is Guoyu. It's like the national language. So everyone speaks Guoyu, but everyone is also influenced by the region that they grow up in. And so this affects people's pronunciation. So people in the northern part of China speak with what's called an R Huayin, which means like a reflexive R sound. So if you hear people speaking Chinese with lots of R sounds, like yar, char, like you know, a good example of this guy is Koyu, what's his name? Chris Masere. The English teacher that's like who's Chinese is like crazy. Chris Lama. Yeah, Chris Lama Masere. If you don't know who he is and you're studying Chinese, check him out. Chris Masere. Lama Masere. But the way he introduces, he's got a very classic like Beijing accent. He was like, "What's up, guys? We'll call you Chris Masere. Like that's a very Beijing kind of accent. And that's kind of hard because you got to get used to the R Hawaiian and stuff. But the people from the South don't use that, but then they have their own thing going. Like in Cantonese, for example, a lot of words that start with N, they'll use L instead. And that slips into their Mandarin as well. So like, for example, like in Cantonese, for example, the way you're supposed to say hello is neho, but a lot of people say leho, right? So they'll swap the N with the L sounds. Or they'll cut off like the j sh, sh sounds. They'll just cut off the j sound. For example, like to say I know in Mandarin is 我知道, like I know 我知道. Well, in like Taiwan, for example, or southern China, they'll just drop off the j sound and say 我知道, 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 我知道. So 知道 is different from 知道. So it was like there's a textbook way to like pronounce things in Mandarin Chinese that you come across in your textbooks. Or even on some of the YouTube channels I watch, like Yo-Yo Chinese, for example, has got a really amazing dope like pronunciation course like guide to go through. It's on the website and it's on YouTube, so definitely check that out. And they also do a really good job of like explaining the fact that not everyone pronounces things the same way. They got some good YouTube Hangouts on that, Google Hangouts on that as well. But like they go through, like Yang Chen goes through a really detailed breakdown of like how to pronounce things. And you'll find that when you learn how to speak Chinese, the very kind of biaojuan, which means just very standard way. Like people do not speak the way that they are. Most people do not speak the textbook way, and because China is such a huge country, and you want to, I know Taiwan's separate from China, but like you include the entire Chinese speaking world, Taiwan, southern China, northern China, the influences that the regional dialects have had, the influence that people's Cantonese has had in their manner, and the influence of people's, Taiwanese, Hokkien, etc., has had in their manner. Like people say things a lot. I mean, it's the same language, manner is the same everywhere you go. But the regional dialects play a huge impact on how people speak their Mandarin, and it's something you got to get used to. And yeah, I mean, I could go off. That's a whole other topic. But just suffice, regional dialects play a huge impact in Chinese, whereas in the Japanese that doesn't nearly as much. So to recap, the Chinese, what makes Chinese easier than Japanese? Simpler grammar, right? No verb conjugations, more people to practice with. That's a plus. And then the one writing system, I've talked about that. That's both a plus and a negative. It's the hardest part of the Japanese writing system, but just having one writing system is kind of nice. You just dive right into kanji, or Hanzi is called kanji in Japanese, what's called. So that's kind of like that's like both a pro and a con. Hope that made sense. And then what's harder with it is the pronunciation, the listening component, just because of the tones. Tones make it harder. I found as I've started doing both Chinese and Japanese that I have an easier time understanding Japanese people, and I think the reason why is because they don't have the tones. So I listening in Japanese is easier, I think, than Chinese because of the no tone thing, because of the tones, because Chinese has got tones. And then the regional influence. Okay, so hopefully that made sense for why I think the Chinese part of this, what makes it easier, makes it harder. Let's now switch to Nihongo, which is Japanese. So for those that don't know, Mandarin Chinese is called Guoyu, which is national language, or Zhongwen. Zhongwen's kind of what I was taught. But in Japanese is Nihongo. Nihon means Japan, and go means language. So Nihongo. So we're switching from Zhongwen to Nihongo. So Nihongo, what makes Japanese easier than Chinese? Okay, so the first thing I have written down is no tones, right? Which I just talked about like just now. So Japanese doesn't have tones. Okay, now it's important to understand that the Japanese does have something called pitch accent, which basically means like goes like low to high, high to low, right? So there's videos you can look up on that about pitch accent. So whether you start high or low with the word, that affects it. For example, like say the best is psycho, psycho no boom boom, but like I learned this week that like it's supposed to kind of go more rising. So psycho, 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 so psycho, come like that, like low to high. So that kind of thing, does exist. But if you get the pitch accent wrong, it's not nearly as like fatal as getting the tones wrong is in Mandarin. So if that makes any kind of sense. So yeah, it's just not as fatal. Like that's the key. It's just not as fatal to get pitch accent wrong. I'm not saying it's not important. It's very, very important. You definitely need to do pitch accent if you want to get your Japanese just right. But the tones, having no tones, specifically in Japanese, makes, I think, speaking it easier, just speaking it and pronouncing it, and then listening to people. So like once you know once you hear the word, once you know the word, for example, tanoshi means fun. You hear tanoshi, boom, it's fun. You don't have to worry about, oh, well, the tone, well, if it's tanoshi with a third tone and no. So that part's nice. So no tones makes Japanese really, really nice in that sense. And then second is the writing system. So the writing systems for both Chinese and Japanese have pros and cons to them. So the pros of the Japanese writing system is it doesn't just use the Chinese characters, which is called kanji in Japanese and Hanzi in Mandarin. Okay, so this is definitely a plus for Japanese, that it doesn't only use characters, Chinese characters. And just kind of show you guys really quickly. So in addition to Chinese characters, Japanese has two additional writing systems. One is called hiragana. I'm not sure, maybe on my thing you guys can't see it the right way, maybe it's flipped, but you can kind of see here hiragana, right? That hopefully you guys see this okay. It might be mirrored opposite for you guys because I'm using the Zoom thing here, but it's got a hiragana here. It's got hiragana here, which is like one writing system. It's not expedient. I'm not teaching you guys hiragana, so it's not expedient that you see it the right way, but that's hiragana and there's katakana. Okay, so you guys should at least get the general idea that hiragana and katakana are two different alphabetical scripts that is used in Japanese in addition to Chinese characters. So that's why when you see Japanese being written, you'll see it with like, looks like kind of an alphabetical thing mixed with some Chinese characters. It's using all three. Yeah, the fact that Japanese doesn't solely rely on kanji and that they have their own alphabetical system, they have two of them, is kind of nice. So you don't have to just, you don't have to, you can kind of, if you don't know a kanji, for example, and you want to communicate with somebody, you can write it out in the hiragana or the katakana, and they'll understand you. And for those that don't know, hiragana is the Japanese alphabet used for native Japanese words, and katakana is what's used for loan words that come from English and Dutch and other like international Western languages. A lot of the Japanese, apparently, the loan words originally came from Dutch first, and then later on English. But yeah, so that's what those are. So hiragana is for native Japanese words, and then katakana is used for the loan words. Okay. The third thing I have written down, or the next thing I have written down, is it's not as impacted by regional influence, regional dialects. So there is like what's called Kansai dialect, which is like native to Osaka, and they'll say things a little differently. And there's other dialects as well in Japan, but everyone speaks, kind of basically standard Japanese. Yeah, I mean, there's not nearly the level of influence on regional dialect in Japanese that there is in Chinese. It's not to say it doesn't exist at all. Like I said, there's Hiroshima dialect, there's Kansai dialect, there's other dialects in Japan besides standard Japanese. It's not like if you go up to northern Japan or go down to southern Japan, there's the same kind of like craziness in how people speak that there is between northern and southern China. So because it's a smaller island, and a smaller population of people than China, everyone's more or less speaks in much more similarly, which is nice. So you don't have that same kind of like challenge of, oh my gosh, this is like not the textbook Japanese that was taught. Like most people more or less speak textbook in the sense that they're, there's not some weird, funky, like Hawaiian kind of equivalent for Japanese, is what I'm trying to say. So I think the fact that Japan is a smaller country geographically, and has a smaller population, makes it easier because more people are speaking in a similar kind of way. Hopefully that makes sense. But that's not to say that there's not regional dialects in Japanese, or that aspect doesn't exist at all in Japanese. It does, but not nearly to the same degree that it does in Chinese. Okay. And then the other thing is loan words. Loan words are a real plus in Japanese. Make Japanese easier than Chinese. There's a ton. Computer is computer. Terebi is television. Toire is toilet. America is America. I mean, I could go on and on. Let me find one more random one for you guys here. If I can find a random. Yeah, and find some other kind of random. See if I can find a random katakana phrase. I don't need to look it up. I just thought one just now. Thank you. One way to say thank you is thank you. Thank you means thank you in Japanese. And then there's arigato, which is like the formal, like classic way, but you could also say thank you. So I mean, orange means orange, pinku means pink. There we go. Got some common. Like I mean, and there's just so many loan words. Um, Información counter means information counter. Like there's just so many loan words in Japanese, which is why they have a whole written script dedicated to it, called katakana. So yeah, the loan words in Japanese makes it easier. You don't have that in Chinese. You don't. You got like cafe for coffee, and there's a few other ones, but like I mean, it's not nearly. Whereas in Japanese, got a ton, and that's nice. That's nice. Yeah, like papu musiku is like pop music. Like there's a bunch. Like I mean, so yeah, I don't even go on, but like loanwords makes Japanese. That's like there's a whole. What I'm trying to say is a whole bunch of Japanese words that you can just start learning today. That are part of that are katakana, that are loanwords that build up your vocabulary. Yeah, so the loan words for sure. Okay, let's switch into now what makes uh, Nihongo ga muzakashi. What makes it difficult? The biggest thing, without question, is uh, is the verb conjugation, is the grammar. Okay, so and first is the verb conjugations. This is something I'm still working on. I'm still trying to get better at this. So this is where I'm kind of at right now, is like grinding away at verb conjugations. Um, and Yeah, I mean, so what does that mean? So basically, with each verb, there's different ways to conjugate it. So I'm just kind of read off the ways you conjugate verbs in Japanese. Some of the basic ways. There's plain, non-pass. There's polite non-pass, plain, affirmative non-pass, conditional, volitional, um, um, and yeah, plain. And then you also have, in addition to that, you also have what's called plain form and polite form, right? So you'll hear words end in mas. Well, mas form is polite form. There's also a plain form of the verb. So with each verb, you got to learn the plain forms, the plain way of saying it, and you also got to learn the polite way of saying it, the mas form. Yeah, and then on top of that, you got to also learn, like, when do I use the polite form? When do I use the plain form? And the answer to that is, generally speaking, if you're trying to be more formal, you use the mas form. If you're among friends or family, you use the plain form. Um, but then in addition to that, there's also what's called Keigo, which is like basically like not different from Moss form. It's basically like if you're in a business setting and you're talking to your boss about them, you need to speak in this really like super polite, like honorific way that honors them. But then when you're talking about yourself, you got to speak in this like humble way that like humbles yourself to them. Um, and then when they talk to you in a way where like it makes you like lower than them. And then if you use the wrong speech, and you end up like not, you end up mess up on the case, you can like offend people and stuff. So like Keigo is a whole other level beyond Moss form. Um, and that's kind of scary. And intimidating. I'm not really worrying too much about Keiko right now. I'm kind of shelving that for now. I know it exists, but I'm just trying to get verb conjugations down right now, y'all. It's enough for me. Um, but yeah, I mean, the Keigo aspect of Japanese is intimidating. So just the grammar of Japanese as a whole is much more intimidating than Chinese. Chinese like doesn't really have a Keigo. It doesn't. And I wouldn't say even not really. I mean, the only real like polite words in Chinese are like, instead of saying ni, you say nian. You just add an n at the end of ni and nian, nian hao. That's like a polite way of nian. But you don't really use it that much. It's more of a Beijing thing. It's like, so yeah. I mean, like Chinese doesn't really have that. Um, there's some formal stuff in Chinese, like "nian gui xing," like what is your name? But like, it's not. It's like kind of specialty kind of cases. And if you didn't use it, like no one's gonna get offended. So yeah, I mean, but as in Japanese, like you got the verb conjugations, you have um, the Keigo. Oh, and then there's also learning all the kanji, the Chinese characters, and then there's like two different ways to pronounce each character usually. One is called onyomi, which is modeled after the Chinese way of saying something, and there's kunyomi, which is modeled after the native Japanese way of saying something. And you got to learn like, okay, like when do I use a kanji in the writing, and is it the onyomi or is it the kunyomi? And like generally speaking, it's onyomi if it's back-to-back kanji, and it's kunyomi if it's a kanji isolated in between some hiragana and stuff. But like that's not always the case. So you got to like basically learn like two different ways to pronounce a kanji, and learn when do I use one kanji, when do I use one pronunciation over the other. It makes it tough. It makes it challenging. Okay. So yeah, so Japanese grammar is tougher than Chinese grammar for sure. Um, and then there's also the three writing systems. So the writing systems in Chinese, the writing systems in Japanese is a plus in that you don't have to just do characters. It's nice to have some alphabets, break it up. But on the front end, you do got to learn hiragana and you got to learn katakana. And right now, where I'm at, I pretty much got most of hiragana. I pretty much got most of hiragana down now. I mean, now I'm shifting my focus to katakana now. That's where I'm at now. But you got to learn three writing systems. You still got to learn the Chinese characters, and on top of that, you got to learn the hiragana writing system and the katakana writing system, and they have the same number of characters in both writing systems. Actually, katakana has more, but so that's tough, right? And then so the writing system for Japanese makes it tougher. And the last thing, so hopefully that makes sense to the writing system. You got hiragana, katakana, kanji, three writing systems does make it tougher in that sense, in a way. But then once you get them down, it's easier because it's not all about the kanji all the time, which can become a headache. And then lastly, the last thing I've written down for making Japanese harder is there's not as many people to practice it with. So unless you like live in Japan, it's harder to find people to practice Japanese with. Whereas with Chinese, there's like Chinese diaspora communities all across the globe. You got communities across the United States. Like I'm in the Bay Area, so I got a pretty good community here. London has a huge community. Australia has a huge community. New York City has a huge community. Paris, France has a huge community. It's like all across the globe, basically. Toronto, Canada has a big community. Vancouver, Canada, like Canada does. Like so, basically, like almost like everywhere you go, like you're gonna find there's like Chinese people, and they almost all know Mandarin. So that's a plus. That's a definite plus. And this is one aspect where I think you would say Mandarin versus Japanese specifically, because Mandarin speakers are everywhere. Whereas if you were learning Cantonese, then that would be something that would make Cantonese harder, because it's hard to find Cantonese speakers to practice with the Mandarin speakers. But even then, like in a lot of American Chinatowns, there's still a strong Canto presence there. So anyway, so that's pretty much it for the video. But just to quickly recap, what makes Chinese easier is simpler grammar, more people to practice with, and the one writing system. Hanzi does have its advantages just by being one writing system. But what makes Chinese harder is the tones, both for listening and pronunciation. Then having no alphabet, as I said, makes it harder. And then the regional influence, North, South, China, different pronunciations, different way of saying stuff, makes it harder in that sense. Because they're also influenced by their regional dialects, which are completely different from Mandarin. And then for Japanese, what makes it easier is having no tones is nice. I did mention pitch accent. So if you're looking for a good pitch accent video, do check out Dogen on YouTube. If you're saying Japanese, you got to know who Dogen is. But Dogen's got a really good, he does a great job breaking down pitch accent and stuff. So check him out, Dogen. But there's no tones. So pitch accent's different from tone, and it's easier than tone. Also Japanese doesn't just use kanji. It has an alphabetical system, which helps break up the kanji, which is nice. Talked about that. And then doesn't have it's not as impacted by regional dialects. And then Japanese has a bunch of loan words, right? It's like pinku, orange, computer, toire, information counter, um, and a bunch of other ones too. Kohi for coffee, although coffee is Chinese, but like, yeah, the loan words are a nice thing in Japanese. America, another one. So there's a whole bunch of them. Yeah, so Japanese got the loan words going. That's a plus for sure. But then while Japanese is easier in those areas, what makes Japanese harder um, is uh, is the grammar. You get the verb conjugations, you got the Keigo, and you got to learn. And there's like the onyumi and the kunyumi reading for the kanji. That's tough. And the three writing systems. That's tough. Just having to learn three writing systems is tough. Even though it's nice to have a breakup from the kanji, like three writing systems is still tough. Um, and then and then and then there's not as many people to practice it with. So, but as far as like YouTube resources go, I feel like Japanese has got a really good YouTube community going and really good teachers on there too. So I feel like that part is as much of a problem, but just native speakers to practice with can be harder than Chinese in theory. Just because there's not many Japanese people, and most Japanese people live in Japan. There's not a diaspora of Japanese people across the globe like there is of Chinese people. Chinese people are everywhere, whereas Japanese people are mostly just in Japan. And then finally, in case you want to know which one I think is harder to learn, I don't like saying one's harder than the other just because, you know, I don't want to diminish one over the other. Like if I say Chinese is harder than Japanese, that doesn't mean Japanese is easy. And if I say Japanese is harder, that doesn't mean that Chinese is a cakewalk. They're both really challenging languages. And the reason that you should be enjoying reason why I'm learning them is I like the challenge of it, right? But since I'm debating the topic and some people might want to know, I would give Chinese a slight edge in difficulty over Japanese, primarily because of the fact that Chinese only uses the characters, only uses the Hanzi, and then also the fact that Chinese has the regional influence going, right? And it's just harder because it's just a big community of people and it's such a diversity north and south. So I think that's what makes Chinese harder. I think it's harder because of the regional dialect influences that it has on Mandarin, and then also the fact that it uses the characters. Um, so I think that's what makes Chinese harder. Um, but if you want to talk about like grammar and you want to talk about the writing systems and the complexity of like only like Japanese like kicks Chinese's butt in that department. So I do give Chinese a slight edge, just a slight edge over Japanese in terms of difficulty, but um, it's not like I feel like there's a huge difference there. Oh, and lastly, I do feel like learning both of them simultaneously does help because when I'm studying Chinese, I'm reading the characters, which helps with Japanese. When I'm Japanese, I'm still studying characters, and I'll hear a word in Japanese, for example. Now, oh, that sounds like the Chinese word for this because it's the Onyumi version of that. So they definitely do play off each other well, and they don't sound too much like each other, but there's enough similarities that if you're learning them together, they kind of reinforce each other. So definitely learning both of them together at the same time is definitely possible. Although I think it would help if you had a more of a foundation in one over the other before you started. So if you started both from scratch, that'd be tough. But if you did what I did and started with Chinese first, and then after a couple of years of Chinese, you then started doing Japanese, that could work. And then I think the opposite could be said true. If you did 2 years Japanese first and you want to dive into Chinese, same thing, that would help. So yeah. Anyway, this video has gone on long enough, y'all. If you want to connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the handle is Slam Dunk 406. So once again, the handle is Slam Dunk 406 for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And I'll leave a description. I'll mention that in the description. And of course, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you're interested in more of my videos on my Chinese, Japanese language learning journey and just find my insights useful for some reason, feel free to subscribe. And also, if you like basketball stuff and piano tutorials and Michael Jackson piano songs, subscribe and stick around for those as well. So until next time, I'll see you guys. And yeah, that's about it, y'all. Peace. I guess I can say goodbye in the languages that I speak. So that would be 再见 in Mandarin, and that would be 再见 in Cantonese, and that would be sayonara in Japanese. So there we go.